a remnant site, oftentimes close to your restored site, is because you're trying to find something that's like possible within that context, and something that you can like that's like realistic for you to restore towards. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about reference sites because a lot of things come up with how they're being used and how they can apply in different situations. So just as a history of the Sacramento River, pre-contact, before a lot of development, especially when it got colonized by Americans, there was large swaths of floodplain that could extend miles in either direction. And there was a lot of riparian scrub. And this is just a coarse map I have on the right. But there are these just huge areas that had a lot of wetland, a lot of riparian forest, and a lot of riparian scrub. And it was just part of the natural landscape. And largely through agriculture, a lot of this land was converted. I mean, the first human civilizations often colonized floodplains all over the place. So often colonized riparian habitat because of the great soils, the great access to groundwater. It was easy to get flood irrigation because you're next to a river. And so intensive agriculture removed most of the riparian forests along the Sacramento Valley by the 1980s. This is about a 95% reduction in habitat, which is pretty high. I mean, it's pretty high for California. I mean, you look at other things like wetlands. California wetlands have faced similar degradation. Grasslands may even more, but there was almost a complete removal of the habitat. And a lot of these sort of cottonwood and other unique plant communities were given special status. And I'll get to that, the solution to that a little bit later. But if that disturbance wasn't enough, for many reasons, dams were put in to intentionally attenuate the natural flood regime. So to reduce the amount of intense flooding in the winter and to provide more water flows in the summer. And a lot of riparian habitat depend on these peaky flows because when you have a lot of water moving down the river, you have a lot of energy, and you can have a lot of new floodplain creation, a lot of meander of the river, deposition of new floodplains. And a lot of pioneer tree populations really depend on these new floodplains. They're frankly fairly nutrient depleted. And so things like cottonwoods and willows are really competitive in these low nutrient habitats. Whereas when they get older, these floodplains get older and they get more deposition of nutrient-rich soils, things like oaks and ashes become a lot more competitive and outcompete them. And so there's been a large reduction in pioneer tree populations that a lot of very important special status species like yellow-billed cuckoo completely depend on. So you have these two huge factors influencing riparian forests along the Sacramento River. So Senate Bill 1086 was passed in 1987, which created the Riparian Joint Venture. And their objective was to create large swaths of restored habitat and put it into the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge. And here's a picture on the right that shows different stages for the same area over about a 15-year period taken by Greg Golette and showing a lot of successful tree recruitment on these sites. A lot of this restoration focused on tree planting rather than restoring natural processes, although there were a couple of areas where levees were breached and you got some hydrological connectivity between surface flows and it getting into these sites. Some of these restored sites are behind a levee, so flooding is a lot less frequent than it otherwise would be. And a lot of studies, especially with funds from this first effort, looked at recovery and found a good tree recovery, and they did some understory studies, but they weren't woven together and they were only done for a medium period of time. And none of them really came back in a much longer period and looked at what was changing as these forests have started becoming middle-aged. And so I'm going to have two different maps here on the right, but here's the first one just showing the extent of the whole area and showing where there's restored forest and where there's reference ones. I'll have another one that shows some of the sites I selected, but the previous studies took place over this 100-mile long region. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the measures they had and resampling the same with this. I'm resampling the same overstory and understory measures that were done in the previous surveys so I can compare how they changed over time and in the exact same locations that they were studied. And so what this gives me with this study is a 17 to 32-year-old range for how restored forests are in that age range. And a really nice chronosequence looking at change over time. And so if I jump to this other map, these are all the restored sites are somewhat evenly distributed over this middle reach of the Sacramento River. And I'd always pick reference sites that were nearby so that they had similar site conditions. So I'm going to go through a bunch of pictures now. I love pictures. I love sharing pictures. And here's a first one that's a restored forest that's maybe on one end of the spectrum for how homogeneous it is. You can see this is one of the older restored sites. This is Ord Bend, which was restored in the early 90s, very early 90s. And you can still see a grid, and some restored sites look like this. I mean, this forest is about 30 years old. There's oak trees. They're not very tall. The understory is pretty covered in litter, but not a lot of understory cover. But you get some that are more complex. This is maybe a little further north, and you have more variety of deadwood, especially from willows. You have a little bit more complexity. You have some rubus or miniacus that I'm going to talk about a lot, invading it. You have a little bit of sycamores that are dying. And they can get even more complex, where you have more variability in stem sizes, which is great. You have some large cottonwoods, you have some maple, you have some willows coming in that are still alive. You have quite a bit of rubus or miniacus in the bottom, which made it hard to trek through, but this is definitely not the hardest forest to trek through. I just wanted to share a picture of what the understory could look like at times, and I was in one for reference, and then also it's a reference forest. There was mugwort that was maybe 8 feet tall, and it was quite fun to walk through. But there were other restored forests that maybe had 7 or 8 foot tall blackberry that was mostly alive. That was also really hard to walk through. So you got some sites that had almost no understory, and you had some sites that was incredibly dense. Reference forests weren't as homogeneous as far as tree planting. You had a lot more large woody debris. You would still get invasion of rubus and miniacus, but most of the sites weren't completely dominated by it. You got things like Carex barbari coming in. You had a lot of bromes that I'll get into more later. Um, in the winter, you'd sometimes get these complete monocultures of California grape that was completely defoliated until the spring came, where it would light up green. These areas were almost impossible to walk through. You'd have to go around. Sometimes you'd walk through the grape and you'd be above the river, and there'd be no earth behind you, no earth below you, and it'd be it was safe and it was strong. It was quite hard to walk over, though. Reference forests in general, a lot more even vertically heterogeneous. You had a lot of, in this picture, you had a lot of grape making up the mid-story. Very wild. You had to be careful about getting through it, but they still distinctly looked different than restored forests. So there were some thoughts about like, well, maybe these are completely different forests, and maybe they won't be the same thing. And then reference forests in general closer to the river. That's why they were never or rarely converted into farmland. A lot of forest was converted into nut orchards. And when they flooded, because they're so close to the river, and they flooded over and over again, it was hard for the farmers to make money. So they oftentimes let it rewild, and they weren't really disturbed very long. So they do represent good targets for restoration. And this is more of what an average reference site looked like. There are a lot of different woody species in the understory, somewhat easy to walk through, a lot of cottonwoods. And so restoration researchers are really into talking about their theoretical framing. They love to do it because it helps you generalize between different continents and talk about restoration more broadly. It has its pros and cons, but it is good to seed it in to kind of say what this is an example of. And what I'm testing in this project is around convergence. And a lot of research, especially early on, like in the 1980s, like Brad Shaw, talks about more of this field of dreams idea, and even older research, where if you plant a restoration site and you have the right conditions, uh, along some dimension of ecological conditions, it could be native understory cover, something that you care about, it'll get better over time and it'll increase. And your reference site won't really degrade, it'll just stay the same. And it's just a target to be met, but this is just more of as long as you restore right, this is an inevitability. But based on my first visits looking at the amount of Himalayan blackberry, Rubus or miniacus in the understory, I worried that the opposite could be true. That restored forests could stop recovering, they could arrest, they could, stagnate and not get any better, and that reference sites could get invaded and they could get worse. And you could still have convergence, which is one of these goals in a lot of restoration projects, but in the worst way possible. But the reality is a lot more complicated. You can get convergence, you could get divergence. Things could just be different and never become the same. So there's a lot of different pathways that forests can change in, especially in a complex system like a riparian forest, dealing with a lot of different flood influences, some fire, different invasion, different recruitment of native species. And so a lot of my research is seated around where are these forests converging? And is that even a useful metric to compare them? Or where is that a useful metric? And this is derived a lot from the alternative stable states literature, which brings into a degraded habitat can get pushed into a new equilibrium. And that may be easy to recover, but it may not be. If you have a shift in how the system works, like you exclude fire, or you exclude flooding, that might be really hard to recover. Maybe it isn't. And you can get these ecosystems in these with these species assemblages that haven't been seen before, but nonetheless they're still stable. And just because they get a disturbance doesn't mean they change. Like they could actually be very resistant to change, despite being something that might not historically have been on the landscape. And so I was building off these two studies, and I'm going to talk about the overstory one first, which was the trees that were being measured. And I was trying to see how things were changing from their observations. So Kathy Little, who did her master's at CSU Chico, found that restored forests had a very distinct tree species composition. That the assemblages, the types of trees that you'd find together in a landscape were completely different than anything you would see naturally. And that you would see in restored forests. You were seeing like early successional species like willows with like late successional species like oaks, and they just normally that would take so much time for oaks to join into the landscape that you wouldn't find them together in the same space. I also built off John Stella's research, who did a lot of reference sites. And he found that you had this strong transition from willow to cottonwood around 30 to 40 years of age, and you didn't really get to late successional until about 80 years. And that was really helpful to have as data set, even though I was asking different questions, because it could help me with what I was trying to understand, which are changes of composition and structure, which I'll get into more later in the results. The other study I was building off simultaneously was an understory study. And that understory study also found that recovery was incomplete, and that not all the goals were being met. And so there were two previous studies, one from my major advisor and her colleague, and one from McLean et al., who did his master's at Chico. And what they found is that restored forests were recovering. And as the overstory was closing, they were gaining native shade tolerant species, which was good, but there was still a big gap, and there was still way fewer abundance or way lower abundance of native species than reference forests. And maybe more time would be that all that it would take for native species to increase, but maybe not. And unfortunately, like one of the dominant native species in the landscape was largely gallium aperine. There wasn't a lot of evenness of different native species, which was also concerning. And that survey was done in 2007. So my resurvey was a good period of time after that. And so I had to combine them two together, and I had to study the understory and overstory in the same spaces, which was a little bit of a modification of the sampling design. And largely that was because there was so much thatch for Morbus armeniacus that it could take like a minute to move like a yard. And when you're trying to cover like kilometers every day, or miles every day, it's just like not feasible. You're just not going to get good sample replication. And so I'm going to show a picture. Oh, and I sampled in 2021 and 2022. It's just there was a lot of sites, and it took that much time to get it. And those years were a little bit dry, which could affect the results. But they're still quite interesting. So all in all, I did 78 sites, and that was 37 restored sites and 41 reference sites. So I did pretty much all the restored sites that were available, and then I picked 41 of the closest, not always the closest, but close reference sites. I tried to vary them up a little bit with what their elevation was from the river to give more of a balanced perspective. And so in this picture, this is what a plot looked like. It was 20 meters tall, facing north, and 30 meters wide. And all the red squares are where I sampled understory quadrats. And those could rotate a little bit based on a random number generator to make some evenness. But this was great because what I was doing is I was measuring all the stems for all the trees that were greater than 2.5 centimeters at chest height. But I was also doing shrub transects. from the center line. And then at either end of the shrub transect, I would get these quadrats. And I'm not going to talk about the shrub transect data in this presentation because it's sort of redundant with my understory measures. And it's nice to have kind of the fewest amount of data that you need to tell the story so it doesn't get convoluted. So I'm focusing mainly on the quadrats and on the tree measurements. And so I'd measure all the trees, I'd measure their diameter, and I'd get their species. And for the understory quadrats, I would measure the cover, the absolute cover of all the species inside a 1 by 1 meter quadrat. And so I'm going to get into the results, but the first thing I want to talk about is going to be the structure of the trees. And so I talk about this with two different measures, one with stem density and one with basal area. And so I actually couldn't find a good figure, so I used Dolly and I modified it in Photoshop. But basal area is the number, if you took like a knife and you cut all the trees in an area and you got all the stems and you pushed them together so there was no gaps in air, like that area that it's covering is the basal area. It's the amount of area of stems for a given area, and it's a good way to look at biomass, the amount of wood that's on an area. Stem count is just the number of stems, so it gets you an idea, like, is all that wood area in one giant tree or is it in a bunch of little trees? And this tells you about the geometry of the forest, which is important for thinking about how it could change over time, but also how it could be used as habitat for different species. And so if you look at overstory structure and you look at these two metrics I just talked about, you largely find that restored and reference forests have converged, which is great. It's excellent. That the basal area was lower for restored forests, but they had a larger slope. They've been growing more over time. And as they get into these middle ages between late 20s and early 30s, they've converged. And if you look at stem density, it was much higher. If you look in the bottom figure on panel B, you look at stem density was much higher in reference forests, and that has gone down. And so I really like this figure because all your hollow points are prior survey data and all your solid points are current survey data. And I resampled the exact same plots rather than doing some sort of substitution. So you know actually how each plot has changed. And in green is reference and in blue is restored. And so it is a little bit interesting that restored forests are increasing in biomass and the reference forests, at least within this age range, are not. Part of that could have been from the 2015 drought, where there were quite a few cottonwoods that were large cottonwoods that were lost in reference forests, and that could have evened out the slope towards zero. And then it's also interesting that reference forests had a very high stem density, and that's coming down and matching restored forests to this huge mortality, which is normal with reference forests. They just, when they naturally recruit on the floodplain, you get this like incredible recruitment of willows and cottonwoods, and they just get thinned out over time. Like you can have tens of thousands of them per acre when they start out. That can get thinned down to 1% of that. So all in all, restoration on this landscape has been effective at recovering biomass and having the same amount of stems. And that is great. And that recovers over time without any additional intervention. If you get into composition, though, the story is a little bit different. And so I'm going to walk everyone through this. This is a type of ordination. It's called a non-metric dimensional scaling. And what it does is allows you to compare the composition, which is like the ratio of different species for the different types of forests. So each point corresponds to a plot that I sampled, where the solid points are the current survey and the hollow points are the previous one. And the ellipses represent 2/3 of that spread of data for each of those groups. So it allows you to see, like, in general, are reference forests different than restored forests? And the answer is yes. Both of them have changed a little bit, not very much over the 10 to 16 years between surveys, but they're still different. They started out different, they were planted different, and they haven't converged. And I'm going to go through some of the species with pictures that are different, because what these little annotations are that represent the species codes are the first two letters are the genus and the last two letters are the species. And it's just a way to fit everything on a graph. And you all don't necessarily get the legends. I'll have some pictures in. And I want to add one more thing. These arrows are environmental fits, and they tell you, they give you these like axes. So as you move on the site age arrow, as you move closer to the arrowhead, you get older, like as opposed to the other direction where you get younger. And same with distance to river, and same to relative floodplain elevation. And so what it says is that reference forests are older. And as they get older, they have more juglans hinsii and elderberry, which you'd at least expect that jungle's hinsai because it's a late successional species. It also says that restored forests are further away from the river, which you expect because largely those areas were converted to farmland. And it also says that the relative floodplain elevation, and that just means how high is the land above the river, is not that different between the two landscapes, which is a little bit surprising, but not super surprising. The floodplains can be quite flat. So for the first species, which especially occurs in older restored forests, you have Juglans hinsai, which is black walnut, which is native. It has a little bit of hybridization with the domesticated Juglans reglans, the English walnut, but not a lot of contamination. So it's native. If you get into restored forests, especially in ones that are older in the direction that it's been moving to, you have like Quercus lobata, which is more upland, which you might expect because it's further from the river. One of the only two species that you really find in both forests that's overlapping is box elder, which a maple, Acer negundo. But largely, I mean, they both have willows, especially when they're younger. But reference forests have a little bit more Salix laceulandra and Salix goodingi, whereas restored forests have a different one. They have more Salix laceulepis. Reference forests, interestingly, had, especially in the oxbows, like the Vanda and river channels around them, they had a lot of fig, which is invasive, which I have a picture later. It's really hard to walk through. And then restored and reference forests had a lot of cottonwood. They had a lot of overlap there. So I'm going to jump into the results for the understory now. And the understory, I should have prefaced earlier, is the forest floor. It's everything I've measured that's below 1.25 meters, so like about below, I don't know, 5.5 feet. So it's the forest floor. And this first figure is if you break up all the species either into exotics or natives, and you look at the total cover of them. And you find that, especially in a convergence framework, that unrestored exotic cover is converging between the two forests. It's decreasing in restored forests, and it's increasing a lot in reference forests, whereas native cover is not really changing that much over this, 13 to 14-year period. And a lot of this is being driven by, in reference forests, there was a huge recruitment of a lot of bromuses. They were doing a good job of moving in. They represented a lot of that change. And that caused a lot of the increase in exotic cover. But in restored forests, you had a huge decline of festucas, a lot of exotic festucas for whatever reason. I don't know if it was the drought or I don't know if it was getting shaded out, but they got replaced by exotic hordeums, and avenas, but you really did not see that much festuca, where it was very common in the previous survey. And here's another ordination showing the change in understory composition between restored and reference forests. And so if you look at restored forests and you look at their ellipses, restored forests have changed a lot. They have a largely different species composition. They have more overlap with reference forests. But reference forests really haven't changed that much at all. They've expanded a little bit in their range, but in part that could have been because I surveyed more reference forests in more locations, and that could be part of it. But they largely haven't changed. And if you use a Permanova permutational multivariate analysis of variance, it can tell you like which ones are significant, which groups are significantly different, and which ones aren't. And you find that the only groups that are different are the previous restored survey and the current one. Reference forests, like as is also shown by this figure, really haven't changed at all. As far as their composition, the previous survey shows a change in exotic cover, but as far as the ratio of species, that's relatively the same. And this is being driven by a lot of different species. And the primary one is Rubus arminiacus went from like, if based on my shrub transects, it went from like 19% cover to like almost 80. So it went from being not a dominant species to a quite dominant one in restored landscapes. And it was in reference forest a little bit, but it was very dominant and restored. Other species that you found in the middle were Gallium aperine. And I don't know if I said earlier, but these pictures are corresponding to where they are in this ordination. Gallium aperine was, especially last year when it rained a lot, was really dominant. It was actually like hard to walk through. It would like lock you around your ankles and you had to high step, but it was also really hot at the same time. So that made it a bit trying. but that was definitely very present both in restored and reference forests. Pterolis arvensis was a hedge parsley, and that was very common. It did well around blackberry, maybe not amazing, but it did well. You saw that in a lot of restored forests. Carex barbari was very common in both forests, very competitive, also known as white root. And then Festuca perennis was very common earlier. As far as some other sun-loving species, there was crabgrass and some hordeums that were really common in restored forests. They're just, I didn't, you still found them, but they didn't have that much cover. So this figure, I'm going to get into this. This is a path analysis, but if you're trying to understand what is improving native, what is related with higher native understory cover, which is a huge target of this research. Like what are the things that are positively related with it? They're not causal, they're not saying what's causing it, but like what are, if you listed all these different factors along the landscape, which ones are positively associated? Which ones, one of them could be relevant in understanding like why some landscapes do better than others. You find that first off, um, overstory cover has the strongest out of all the relationships, the strongest relationship that's negative with exotic overstory cover. And so what that's saying is that getting a lot of shade in early on is really good at suppressing exotic understory species. Except I removed Rubus arminiacus from that. So every exotic understory species in the landscape except Rubus arminiacus. And that was found in previous studies that like get the shade in earlier. It's an environmental filter. It's a good way to get rid of exotic Mediterranean grasses. And this study reinforces that that's definitely a great idea. But where that breaks down is that Rubus arminiacus is positively associated with shadier sites that have more overstory cover. And so if you're trying to shade out exotic species, it might not work at all. And that's not necessarily to say that like Rubus arminiacus prefers, or Himalayan blackberry prefers shaded sites. It's just really shade tolerant. And shading it out is just not going to be effective. And Rubus has a very strong negative relationship with native understory cover. So where it's common, a lot of native plants aren't. And it has the same relationship with other exotic species. It's really pushing everything out. And these are largely these are the strongest relationships on the landscape. And there are some other positive notes that if you're further from the river, you have less native understory cover. And if you're further from reference forests, you have less native understory cover. So if you plant a restored forest near the river or near a reference forest, there's a good chance you could get more. There's an association that you could get more native understory cover. This isn't causal. There would be an experiment to really reinforce that. And this kind of gets me into my next point, and that a lot of other studies have found issues with these woody, kind of Rubus is a woody species, these woody exotic species that are really shade tolerant coming in and degrading the landscape and either reducing native understory richness and being quite competitive. And Rubus arminiacus is a problem in Oregon. There's other types of Rubus species that are exotic that are a problem in the Galapagos. There's woody species in France and Germany that are a problem. There's ginger is an issue in the tropics. There's a lot of shade tolerant species that aren't being affected by this shade out the exotic species strategy that are becoming a problem all over the world. And so that's something that like other studies should definitely build upon. But first, to kind of get into my conclusions and talk about how I look at each of these results as far as like, well, where have we succeeded and where have we failed? Repeat surveys are a really powerful way to observe changes in forest composition and structure. They're great. I was very lucky to have an opportunity to have a data set to build off of, and hopefully more people get that in the future because they can tell you the direction of change, not just like whether or not you're meeting your goals or not meeting your goals. They can tell you if things are going in a positive direction, in a negative direction, if they're moving in parallel and not really getting better or worse, if there's something novel happening. And so more of these studies should definitely happen. Obviously, they're labor intensive, but they're really powerful and you can just keep building off of them. Like these forests aren't yet old growth. But if you're going to look at everything within this convergence framework, like overstory structure is converging, like basal area and stem density, it's doing great. Like those are improving over time. The restored forests are resembling reference forests as far as the number of trees and the sizes of the trees in the landscape. And that's excellent. If you look at overstory composition, though, they're moving in parallel. They both have almost exclusively native species, which is great, but reference forests have different assemblages. They have different associated species in a landscape than restored forests do. And that might change over time, that might converge, but some of these forests that I've surveyed are like 33 years old. So I don't see why I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. And a lot of old growth forests are quite a bit older, so maybe in 20 or 30 years this could happen. But if you're trying to restore forests, you definitely want to think about picking species that exist with each other naturally. If you look at understory composition, just the ratios of different species you find on a site, they're also not converging. They're different. Reference forests have different species. They're largely have more herbaceous species, where restored forests have woodier species and of different types. And there's some overlap, but they're not they're not clearly getting closer. They could be. It could take more time. It's a little bit harder to measure, but they're not clearly getting closer. And if you group everything by native and exotic cover, you're getting convergence, but from degradation, where exotic cover is increasing in reference forests and becoming more similar to exotic cover in restored forests, and you're getting a stagnation of native cover. So that's not improving or declining largely over time. And so my implications for restoration, I think these are good to have, and these might be kind of broad and maybe not super specific, but when you create a planting palette for trees, they need to reflect local alliances on the landscape. Like you need to have like a willow cottonwood alliance, or you need to have some sort of elderberry savanna, something that you would find in that larger landscape, not a planting of a bunch of different species. And a lot of restoration along the Sacramento River has been changing, and a lot of new projects are thinking about more realistic assemblages. And, a lot of this stuff started in the 80s when restoration was fairly new and people were just trying to get native cover to go up. So it was just seeing what would stick. But now that we know what sticks, it's important to think about planting something that reflects a local alliance so that creates an ecosystem that's legible to native wildlife and other and with more predictable changes over the long run. Additionally, just because you plant an understory with native seeds might not be enough to recover it to the same level as reference forests. It definitely did a lot. It definitely was way better than it was as farmland or what it would be as just completely abandoned fields. And that was good, but seeding alone might not be enough intervention to recover these forests. Additionally, if reference forests are your target, they might degrade over time and they might not be a perfect target. It's difficult to hit a moving target and try to reach that as a goal, especially when it's moving, but definitely when it's degrading in some ways over time. And so restoration might need to think about like, yes, what are natural habitats like on this landscape and what's possible, but maybe thinking about other goals that might be better than reference sites of the landscape or other targets that are higher than that. And then lastly, shade-tolerant shrubs are a problem globally, and it'd be great if there was experimental research looking at this or observational studies about different ways to control it. Like it may be more ecological flows or more fire could help on the landscape, but definitely getting overstory cover up quickly, especially in a forest restoration site, maybe not in a savanna or in a grassland, but definitely in a forest, getting it up quickly is good. It keeps out a lot of exotic grasses and continues to do that. But there might need to be like a second phase of intervention to deal with shade-tolerant exotics. And then really quickly, before I wrap up, I just want to talk about my other two projects. I'm also studying habitat complexity on the landscape using remotely sensed data. And I just wanted to share one result that this figure has. I know these are a box plot with really big ranges, but one really cool result I found from this other study in my research is that in a different chapter of my research is that if you look just at the complexity of the shape of the forests, like restored forests start out as really even and orderly, and they get more complex over time, but the ground doesn't. So the ground is largely flat as a legacy of tilling and agriculture, and that does not recover over time. So restoration projects might need to either do earth moving if they want to put more roughness in the landscape to match a natural floodplain, or they might have to do more dam releases and ecological flows to get more scouring to come in. And then my third and final chapter of my research looks at people's aesthetic preferences along the landscape and trying to understand, do fishers and hunters have different preferences than like hikers and restoration ecologists? And that's really only targeting people that live near the river. And I know some people in this room have already taken the survey, and I really appreciate that. Please email me. My email will be at the end if you're interested and you know anyone that might want to take it that lives near the Sacramento River. But there's surveys at restorationvisualizer.com. And I really just need like 3 more anglers, and then I have my minimum, and I can technically have enough results to publish it, which would be great. And then I wanted to thank all the people that funded this project. And I really wanted to thank my field assistant, James Armis, who went into the bush with me. And this is a picture of me stumbling through some wild fig, which was quite hard to cut through. We were doing some exploring early on and just trying to see the range of sites, and it felt very novel to me. So, in that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Brooke, that was a phenomenal presentation. I really appreciate you bringing this to the Sacramento Valley chapter CNPS tonight. I wanted to ask you, I think that this is really, really important. Of course, plants are and vegetation assemblages are the basis of habitat. And, you mentioned Western yellow-billed cuckoo at the beginning of your presentation. That is absolutely a special status species, and something that there's a lot of interest in. But of course, there's a lot more common species as well. I know that this is a little outside, but I'm curious, you know, um, based on what you've seen, these different assemblages, what do you suspect are the implications for wildlife species? And really, I mean, most restoration is happening kind of with the target of restoring to or for species habitat.
I think around that, especially with the yellow-billed cuckoo, but I think there's Leaf-Bell's Vireo, depends on, they're like really complex willow and cottonwood scrub. And these forests, like those forests don't really live longer than like 40 years, 40, 50 years, and they really want new floodplain. And so like you could restore a forest with cottonwood, but then at some point it's going to get replaced by oaks and black walnuts, and then you're going to need to find new land to plant cottonwoods in. And it's really difficult when like new floodplain isn't really getting created because the river's not meandering nearly as much as it used to. And so that feels like a tricky problem because you can't necessarily like plant your way out of that one unless you can just keep finding new areas to restore. And you really either want, to release more water from the dam during the winter, which can be good for fish flows. It does reduce supply for agriculture, but you might need to release more water and like let more of that natural scouring and floodplain creation happen to try to create more natural cottonwood habitat. But you need to think about like other ways of restoring outside just like a site, the site, local site level.
That's fascinating. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We've got a couple more minutes this evening. Brooke, it takes a lot of effort to walk through these forests like you have to gather this kind of data and be systematic about it. I think that your graphs, showing that you had sampled the same plots are really powerful. I think that this kind of stuff is, it's not very common necessarily in the scientific literature, and I think it gives us a really great point. So I hope that, in the future, folks are, finding your publications and replicating your methods here, because I think this really gets to an important question of, what do these restored forests look like in the future? And this is the kind of research that we need to help answer these questions.
Thank you for that. Thank you. That's really kind, Sarah.
Oh, I mean it, Brooke. It's an important question. Something that, I have noodled on for a long time. I'm not a restoration ecologist, but having worked in these systems for a long time, coming at it also from a regulatory standpoint, it is absolutely something that is important to understand. what we're doing on the landscape, how these ecosystems are converging or diverging. Of course, invasive species is quite a problem. I see that something just came in the chat. Do you have any younger reference sites? Floodplains are important, but they all seem to be
Yeah.
older.
It's my youngest reference sites were like it was done during John's survey in like 2010, but I had some that were like 6 years old. Uh, Unfortunately, by the time I got to them, it was like, 10 years later. So they were like 20 years old. And I was really focusing on resampling. So a lot of my sites are definitely like younger, but like younger middle aged, but not super young. And I know that that it would be good to like do repeat surveys on very young or like do new surveys on very young floodplain forests to see how they're doing and what sort of composition they have.
I'm not seeing anything else pop up. I'll just put that out there one more time. If you've got any questions, go ahead, drop those in the Q&A. Otherwise, I thank everyone for attending this evening. I think that this is a really important topic, and it was a pleasure to host you this evening. Brooke, thank you for sharing this research with us. And also, if you want to drop that link, if you have that readily available, Brooke, or you want to scroll back to your Zoom link, there we go, restorationvisualizer.com. So please help Brooke out. Take that survey for him. So he needs 3 more survey participants to have a
Or
publishable study.
need 3 more
Okay.
anglers, either anglers, hunters, or farmers. And I'd be happy to get more hikers and restoration ecologists. But I definitely need more of these like utilitarian folks that use the landscape.
Okay, well, I will copy that and also pass that around. So if you have somebody, you either are a fisher or hunter, go ahead and I'm going to put that in one more time. It's restorationvisualizer.com. Give everyone a chance to connect to that. The presentation will be posted on the CNPS YouTube page. We'll have that done in about a week or so. So I just want to thank everyone again for sharing the last hour with us, and thank you, Brooke, for the wonderful presentation this evening.
Oh, it was great. Thank you for listening. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, have a good evening, everyone. I'm going to end the recording now, and thank you so much.